Awesome. So instead of starting with the whole skateboarding concept and the 10x concept today, I want to skip right to this dollars, code, pixels, and how we use what we've learned so far, and some basic estimates, budgeting, tactics to put it all together and really get in control of our budgets. So we started week one with this basis of we don't want to be the kind of founders that ask how much does this app cost. That completely takes control out of our hands and puts them into throwing work over the wall and expecting it to just get done in kind of a vacuum that we have no control after. Simplest example of this is if we were building a dog walking app, which I think we used as an early example. If we just ask how much will this dog walking app cost me, we might get answers of 20 hours or 200 hours or 2,000 hours, depending on who we ask and what details we give. But if we frame that, how much will this can we build this dog walking app in 2 months with a $12,000 budget, all of a sudden give someone an artificial frame to look at it in both the dimension of time and the dimension of money, and then work backwards from there with, okay, based on our rate, here's how many hours we have, and here's what is and what isn't possible. So again, just to look at things with a perspective of what is the budget, what is the timeline, and to put founders in control of that versus just starting with an open-ended question and asking how much it costs. Obviously, that has to get balanced with getting feedback from team members on what levels of complexity certain features are, but starting with that framework tends to keep founders in much more control than simply asking an open-ended how much will this app cost me question. The other side of this is if you're building a product company, it's not just a one-time cost. If things go well, it's an ever-increasing cost. That's not meant to scare founders. That's just if you're looking at building a one-person photo sharing company versus where Instagram or Facebook are today, there are astronomical differences in cost. And they're all for the right reasons. It's because they need a larger engineering team and more features to build and more countries to support, et cetera. But it would be impossible to answer how much did Instagram cost. It's more about how much does Instagram cost per week or per month or per year. So we talked about this 2x hourly rate a good bit last time. So it's just a simple trick that I wanted to remind everybody of. But it's important as we think about hourly team members, full-time team members, salaries, and everything in between. So I'm going to take us back to this simple example of just what does one person look like and their rate and how do we evaluate that. We're going to be going into this pretty extensively later on. So this is actually a linked spreadsheet that we're going to dive into a good bit. I'm just going to make sure that it's open here. Oops. Great. So we're going to go through a series of different scenarios here of early stage companies, bootstrapping companies, funded companies, an annual budget. But we're going to always stick with a simple example of what is one person going to cost us and keep kind of drawing it back to that in different types of scenarios. So we talked about the 2x rule a good bit before. So just to kind of see it in action, if we had contractors at $25 per hour, working 40 hours per week, almost double our annual rate becomes 50. Same thing with if we do 50, our annual becomes about 100. And if we go to 100, it becomes over 200. Now, if we're adjusting those hours and we're no longer working 40-hour weeks, there becomes pretty significant impact. So if we're working with somebody for just 10 hours a week, all of a sudden there's this magic way to work with someone that's traditionally $100 an hour for 50 grand a year, or just $1,000 a week as compared to a full-time rate. As compared to a full-time rate of $4,000 a week. So we'll go into this much deeper in a bit. But it's important to kind of use this information to think of costs in terms of team members. They don't necessarily always have to be an individual if you're working with a company that's helping you find people or work with people. But at the end of the day, either you will know exactly who you're working with, or you'll know a description of who they're planning to help you work with, or anything in between. But it's much easier to look at this in terms of who exactly am I working with and what may their costs look like versus how much will this app cost me. Again, just like very different lenses at looking at this and giving yourself a lot more information to get in control of these costs and the people that are behind it versus that how much will this app cost me scenario that we've strike through and read a few times over now. And using the examples that we talked about in our apps before, it's not so crazy to think about starting with a stack and translating that to, okay, well, what does that actually mean for people? So we talked about a few different scenarios last time on just the dev sessions of a basic iOS app. So a basic iOS app might use Firebase as a backend and Swift as the front end. And this might already lay out, well, Firebase isn't really a full-on backend. It's just a way to configure a backend using a backend as a service. So one person might be able to work on this full-time, an iOS developer that has some basic understanding in Firebase. So now all of a sudden you can slice this down to, okay, well, there's one team member, and then at least it simplifies your questions down to, well, is it a full-time team member? Is it a part-time team member? How do I work with them? But at least it's already gotten your framework down to, do I need a team? Do I need people, et cetera, to, well, this is a simple Swift application with Firebase as a backend. And once you have that information, you can already isolate it down to, well, there's going to be one person, or there can be one person. Same kind of thing with React Native and a Firebase backend. Sometimes to move faster, you may want to think about multiple team members. That said, at early stages and with simple products, you probably want to isolate towards as few team members as possible. That's not always possible because of speed constraints or if you need to get something launched. But the more people that are working on the same thing, it just creates kind of another cost in terms of separating, maintaining, making sure the two mesh well together. So if you had 20 hours per week for someone to work on one specific skill set, it's probably better for one person to spend 20 hours versus two people spend 10 hours each, just because of the fragmentation of information. That said, once those skill sets become different, if somebody's working on animations while somebody's working on API connections or something else within a stack, then all of a sudden it becomes much easier to split things. And where it becomes necessary to split things is a scenario that might be more like this, where you have a React Native front end, a Node.js backend, and a front end developer might not be familiar with or interested in Node, while a Node developer might not be familiar or interested in React Native. And in this case, just because of the technical architecture of a product, even though we might not be developers ourselves, we can already start thinking the framework of, well, this isn't just using Firebase, this is going to use a custom backend. So since this is Node and using PostgreSQL, we know in this case there's a custom backend being used. And still using that React Native front end, we already know that there's going to be two people involved. So again, we're getting enough information to at least start planning through headcount what our budgets might look like. Same kind of thing with a web app that's React as well. So let's go through these scenarios a little deeper. Because I wanted to kind of point out, okay, well, based on our budgets, well, great that everything costs a lot, but what can I actually do based on specific budgets that I might have at certain points in time? So the earliest stage company, you have an idea with a co-founder, you might have scrapped together either personal fund money or you each decided to put in a few $1,000s or a couple $1,000s, but let's treat this as the earliest stage of a company. Before there's $5,000 to invest in a company, it's incredibly difficult to get much done unless you're doing it all yourself. But let's assume that this is your first outside investment beyond what founders can do. Can everybody see this okay? Should I zoom in a little bit? I see some squinting.
Could you zoom in a little bit?
Fine.
Thank you.
Is that better?
That actually does help.
Okay, cool. So let's say that we have $5,000 starting point in cash, and I'm going to share all these spreadsheets later and basically look at it as the yellow part is editable. That's like my design language for this stuff. So if we wanted to adjust this with, say, a $6,000 budget, it'll adjust the rest of our answers, and that works through all the other sheets as well. So let's start with a $6,000 cash budget. We can, just knowing our budget, pretty quickly answer what is our quarterly and what is our annual, just because of the limitation of it to start with. So if we have a $6,000 budget, we can basically say that this year we're not going to spend more than that. And this quarter, we're probably not going to spend more than that either, because if we try to split that down by a monthly basis, it's just not going to be too much. So we can already start kind of putting it along a timeline before we even know what it is that we're building. So this is without any context on, is it an iOS app, is it a web app or anything? We just know that we have $6,000 in cash. Can anybody tell me a general monthly budget that you might plan from this and why?
Monthly over how long? Over a year?
That's a great question. So that becomes a strategic decision of, well, if I have $6,000 in budget and I want to make the most out of that $6,000, there might be advantage to stretching it, and there might be advantage to using it as quickly as possible. And it's important to understand both scenarios. So stretching it over a year will be unrealistic because it's $6,000. So if you stretch it over a year, it's $500 a month. And that's just typically, depending on your hourly rates, but typically that's not enough time for someone to deliver something of value, and you're probably just going to feel stretched too thin. That said, spending it all in 1 month might not have the desired effect either, because you might not have the room for iteration, improvement. And if $6,000 is the entire budget, you might want to artificially stretch it longer than a month just to give yourself time and just the breathing room to be able to iterate. So 2 example scenarios of a $6,000 budget are running it in 1 month and running it in 2 months. And let's say that we're building a web application, we're building a first prototype of that web application. And if we run that all in 1 month, it will get done faster if we know exactly what it is that we're building. But if we aren't 100% sure and we want to build in some iteration, it might make a lot more sense to artificially split that in 2 $3,000 chunks or 3 $2,000 chunks. What that does is it gives us lines in the sand to create mini milestones instead of an entire milestone, and use that information as we hit each milestone to iterate. So a simple example of that, if we have a web application that's matching freelance writers with job opportunities, we might split that into 2 $3,000 sections. In the first $3,000 section, we have a raw, ugly, usable version that just maybe ourselves, the founders, can actually use. And then that second $3,000 version is going towards the actual skinning or the iteration around that. A different approach to that might be splitting that into 3 $2,000 sections. And again, just setting up 3 other arbitrary milestones, like stage 1 being there's something to look at that I might not be able to click at myself. It's just a developer sharing it with me. Stage 2 is that clickable version. And then stage 3 might be that iteration based on that. And there's a lot of ways that you can slice and dice that. The 2 main factors that I use to determine that are what is that main budget? And is this my entire budget, or is this my prototype or first phase budget? If it's my prototype or first phase budget and I already know exactly what I want to build, I might spend it all at once and then use that as iteration for future phases. If it's my entire budget for now, I'll probably split it smaller so that I can start using whatever I learn over the course of 1 month to inform what I do in month 2. So then to answer kind of these questions more formally, this might mean, okay, well, if I want to split this over 2 months or 3 months, that'll be my monthly budget. And then to convert to weekly, basic math is just divide by 4. If you want to get technical about it, there's about 4.2 weeks in a month. So if you really want to use those ratios, it's closer to 4.2 than 4 between weekly and monthly. But I wouldn't get too lost in those ratios. I would just kind of use this as a framework to think about what is it that I'm going to spend per month, and then let that kind of naturally dictate weekly. I don't think you have to get too specific with this. What does this mean for full-time devs? Well, 0. A full-time dev is going to cost a lot more than $6,000 or $3,000 in a month. So naturally, that budget is just going to limit who you should look at. I have some strong opinions about full-time versus part-time. So I specifically made sure that the guests that are joining us today have kind of the opposite opinion that I do. And they have raised traditional venture capital and have built a more traditional full-time team. So you'll absolutely hear that perspective today as well. I think it's important for people to form their own perspectives and not just go by what one side might feel strongly about and talk loudly and strongly about. So please, use your own experiences and your own view of the world to frame what works best for you. And that might be more of my approach. That might be more Datalogue's approach. That might be something in between. So 0 for full-time devs. For part-time devs, in certain scenario, this could mean more than 1. Because of the budget size, this probably means 1, but probably 1 to 2. And other team members in this kind of budget, you're probably not going to be able to afford many others. You'll concentrate that around one skill set. So with $6,000, if you're coming to kind of a web application project, you probably want to make sure that backend is either being done as a service or being handled in-house. And this is all kind of being focused on on front end, and that you already come with very clear designs of what you're doing. With that kind of budget, there's just not a ton of room for iteration, but you still want to build in those artificial lines in the sand for milestones. And we'll go a little deeper in this scenario later on, because I think this is kind of the closest scenario to where people should start. But let's think about what happens later on. So let's say that we have that same $5,000 in cash, but now we have $100,000 in net income. So now if we split that over annual, quarterly, and monthly budgets, we're getting, so the formula I used here was spend about 90% of actual net income. In the bootstrapping phase, you basically want to grow as fast as you can. So this is not an accounting class, and I don't want to get into the accounting semantics, but for purposes of this session, let's assume that net income is revenue minus expenses, so minus your fixed expenses and your SG&A. So it's money that you have to spend each year. And in here, I'm using a formula of just 90%. The logic there is there's going to be things that happen that you can't always predict, so don't always plan to spend 100% of your budget. Use some factor, whether it's 80%, 90%, or something in between. And because the cash balance was so low in this scenario, I didn't even factor it in. So that this way, if we do run through an entire year, we started with $5,000 in cash and expected $100,000 in net income, we would still end the year with $15,000 in cash. So even if we made some unideal decisions along the way, we still kind of end the year better than where we started here. But we are still spending pretty aggressively because we're in this bootstrapping phase and assuming that growth is the core goal. So in this scenario, how many full-time devs do we think we can work with? So answer is maybe one, and it depends on where in the world you are and what rates look like. But with modern dev prices of in New York and San Francisco, I would use about 150,000 as kind of the all-in benchmark. Certain companies will pay more. So if you're looking at Facebook's cost for an engineer, you're talking more like $250,000 to $300,000 a year. Part of that is because of their aggressive benefits. They might pay someone $200,000 a year, and then the benefits alone might cost about $100,000. And kind of that 1/3 ratio is safe to use, but obviously, please consult whatever benefits packages you're using, et cetera, for exact numbers. That's a very rough number of what benefits might actually cost a company. But the number will obviously be, the number that you're actually paying someone will be less than this annual budget because of that benefits piece. So always assume that there will be at least a third-ish. Sometimes that can be as low as 20%, but 30% of benefit and employer tax costs if you're actually hiring someone full-time. In this scenario, though, you're pretty well set up for part-timers. So you might have something that as an overall figure is less than what one engineer in New York or San Francisco might make, but it does set you up nicely to start thinking about, well, we've got 7,500 that we can use per month. How can that get split between the talent areas where we really have a hole? And as soon as this becomes 200,000, as soon as that becomes 200,000, now we start getting in this position of, well, maybe we can start blending full-timers and part-time devs and start thinking of a couple of combinations of these scenarios of maybe, Jackie at $100,000 or something like that, and then maybe someone else working as a consultant at $75 an hour for 10 hours a week, and all of a sudden, our annual rate is coming up to 143,000, and we're well within that bucket that we just created for ourselves. Does that make sense? Just kind of how I quickly switch from just part-timers to a scenario where we can start mixing part-timers and full-timers? Yeah. But I paid particular attention to that threshold, and I think that threshold is higher than what people anticipate. I do think it's important to work with full-timers as soon as the business can afford it and needs it. That said, working with full-timers ahead of that will bankrupt a company. We have worked with a lot of startups at Turtle already, and I hope that this is looked at optimistically by all of you if you consider yourself lesser technical founders. The reason for failure has not been a non-technical team. The reason for failure every single time has been an inability to run a profit loss. So it's been an inability to budget, an inability to stay in control of these budgets. There's been nothing technical in any case of a turtle project having to pause or stop or fire internal team members. It is every single case has been running out of money. And those running out of money cases, I would argue that if people were more rational about their spend and their burn and where full-timers fit, where part-timers fit, and didn't just get sucked into this kind of dogmatic approach of I'm going to hire people just like Facebook and Google do in New York and San Francisco, I think a lot less of that will happen. I understand the urge to, you want the best so you compete with the best, but we're talking about astronomically different budgets and thresholds of budgets to when you look at these large companies today like Facebook and Google versus what startups are doing. So I think startups have to be a lot more disciplined about how they spend and how they approach than what the traditional mindset of this is. Again, you'll hear kind of the opposite opinion at the end of this session too. And in a funded scenario, where I'm actually going to let you play with this on your own, and let's go into this with Datalogue a bit because I'm just watching the clock here, and they'll be able to talk to this in a lot more detail. And then in the last tab here, and I'm going to let you look at this on your own as well, I kind of laid out how you might want to think about, with a combination of part-timers and full-timers, just a monthly and quarterly approach to that budget. I'm going to jump back to the slides just to make sure that we get through some items before Datalogue joins us. So one big takeaway that I'd like you to have here is, whether you're a developer, whether you're a designer, as a product owner, and as somebody that's in control of budget, you are the translator. So you should be thinking about, okay, well, what does an hour mean in terms of dollars? What does a dollar mean in terms of hours? What does it mean in terms of part-timers and full-timers? And to constantly use these different methods to translate back to something normalized that you can function with, whether that's an hour or whether that's a dollar. And I would urge you to not put the burden of that translation on the people that you're working with. So it might be tempting to tell a developer, well, we have 3,000 in budget or 5,000 in budget or 10,000 in budget, but having them have to make that mental translation to hours is friction that they're taking away from their actual work. So I would make sure that you, managers that you're working with, et cetera, so kind of the business people, are the ones that are doing this translation. I mean, as we went through in all those scenarios, it's not a terribly difficult translation to make. So then we talked about in prior sessions on this fixed budget, fixed timeline, flex scope approach, and I want to reiterate just the importance of that fixed budget and fixed timeline element to any kind of specs. So we had this scenario of a redesigned notification window before, and then we added this idea of a budget is 20 hours and timeline is 2 weeks. And I know that I didn't want to show too much of Turtle here, but Turtle is a visual representation of how I think about budgeting, and I think that what I can show you in there is transferable to using things inside and outside of Turtle. So I am going to pull it up just for this scenario to show you how simple you can frame something like this. So here's this redesign notification window inside of Turtle, and I just created a project where we're going to have a few scenario projects. And let's say in here that the first subtasks are understand existing code, reskin existing window, and get a notification dot to show as actual counted. What we started with, here's the main item. So just like that screenshot before, here's a 20-hour budget. And then we already have 2 items that are basically covering what we need. And then this third item that's kind of a nice to have that's 10 to 12 hours. I am now in a position as a non-technical founder to use this information to say, yes, let's build everything included in here, or let's actually take some of this out or delete something. If we take this get notification dot to show as actual numbers, which might not matter for us right now, all of a sudden, whoops. All of a sudden we have 6 to 9 hours of estimates and a 20-hour budget and are in a much healthier spot than including that nice to have in there. So really simple scenario of starting with a fixed budget and a fixed timeline with a flexible scope, and then using the information that might come back from your team to then make decisions on what actually makes sense for your budget. And it does look like Brian's joining us. Hey, Brian.
Hey, it looks like I slid into a design interview or something.
No, just going over some budgeting scenarios since this is the budget session. Cool. Is Tim joining us today too?
He should be.
Okay, let's give him a couple minutes, and if you don't mind, it's just listening, and we'll kind of finish up some of the content.
Yeah, I'll just hang out and be quiet.
Cool. All right. So, and I'll share that project if anybody's interested with me, just so you can kind of play around with it and use it yourselves. But I also wanted to show you some real cases of what budgets look like for real projects and even some of those scenarios that we talked about in last session. So we talked about this app that was basically an Instagram for coin sharing. I wanted to provide you with the actual hours that went into this so that you can kind of dissect it yourself and begin to better understand it, because I think that whether you're using a system like what I just showed you, or whether you're using spreadsheets yourself, just getting in control of over time what hours certain things are taking will let you speak that development budget language much more naturally. So in this scenario, it looks like I remember the customer started with a 160-hour budget, ended up spending about 85 of it to get to a working prototype. So they were in a very healthy spot. And if you want to review it later, here's quite literally every single screen they worked on, what it took them, and the final end result was a usable application that actually took those photos, gave you the ability to share them to Facebook, and put them in a position to make those best next product decisions. All right, so I'm going to skip a few slides here because we've got our guests. So just around here, and then we kind of went through a real scenario of a real product and what it took to spend. And I pulled out some basics of it. Like, we started with a designed app and a $160K budget, which was $8,000 at a $50 rate at the time. And it got to a usable, stable version, finished in just over 4K. So the position that left the company with was almost 50% of budget remained for iteration, next decision making, and decisions could be made against a real product. I took a screenshot of Venkat jumping in there. This was super early stage at Turtle when we were still pretty involved in projects. This one is, I remember it very deeply. And Venkat jumping in here to quite literally say, like, hey, we've got 77 hours remaining in budget. We're coming up on this 70-hour benchmark of core functionality is usable by the customer in a test application, so that we could strategically set ourselves up for having all this other budget remaining for any kind of future decision making. And it actually happened with proper. Let me zoom in there a bit.
Thank you.
Sorry. I think Sheets like totally changed their menu around, so now there is no menu. You got to search everything. Let's see.
If you click the arrow on the far right-hand side, that'll probably show you some more options.
Fantastic. Thank you.
No problem.
The Zoom isn't really.
Google's products have always been terrible with Zoom.
Yeah.
Zoom in and try and type something, it'll mess up all of your formatting.
So I'll just describe this then, Nick, if there's anything you can't see here. There's just a text message going between Venkat and a developer that was working on this that kind of acknowledged that everything was complete and then shared the actual demo all within that budget. So I want us to go through, using this information that we've collected now in the sample, the examples that we've went through and connecting dollars and pixels and code, and kind of combining this with this prior information of here's what an entire app looks like, and starting to form what team members might be involved there on both a full-time basis, a part-time basis, remembering kind of our ideation versus design versus actual code 10x costs, and those basic principles of skateboarding. I thought we could take a sample application, kind of start it, and this should not take us longer than 10 minutes, so just to kind of show how simple this can be. Start it in an Excel spreadsheet and then actually put it inside of a project and kind of see how it can work down from beginning to end. So let's copy this earliest stage sheet and let's set a first budget. And let's say that it's $10,000. So $10,000 to build a first product. If anybody has a more personal budget they'd like to start with, we can absolutely work through a different scenario. So I'm going to make stuff up unless one of you wants to jump in and feed me info that we can work with. But please feel free. Like, I'm happy to adjust this towards your specific scenarios or a scenario that you're curious about. Otherwise, I'm going to just make up numbers.
Okay.
Hey, Brianna, I have one, but if you have one, you can go.
Why don't we go with yours, Nick?
Okay, could we do 15 instead of 10?
Sure. So we have 15,000. And just to give context, what are we building? Is it a web application? Is it a mobile?
Oh, sorry. It's it'll be just like an iOS. Maybe just stick with that for now. iOS app.
iOS app. And is this specific to Eriously?
Yeah, well actually can we say that it's actually a React Native app, so it'll be cross-platform? Is that going to make a difference here?
Not for the iOS app version of it. Where it will make a
Okay.
difference is if you build in React Native and it still kind of covers all the core functionality that you would have covered in Swift. When
Okay.
it's time to go to Android, there are significant cost savings because of the cross-platform nature. There will be a little bit of customization, but it can be a pretty dramatic drop in cost. So if an iOS app in Swift, so the traditional Apple language, cost $10,000 to build, $20,000 to build, building that in Android again might cost about 90% of that because you're obviously going to learn something in the process. So you'll have some intrinsic savings because of the learned, process savings, but code will not be shared. It's like getting two completely separate degrees versus if you were in school versus if you build it with React Native, it's like doing a dual degree that's very similar to each other. There will be a tiny bit of difference, but you might spend only 10 to 20% of what you spent on the original product to get to the. So the downside to it is you're kind of within the confines of a framework. So something like a very simple iOS animation that's natural inside of Swift might actually take longer to do in React Native, or might be limited to what kind of animations or specific components you might be able to use. But let's say it's an iOS app built in React Native. And is this specific for Eriously? So remind me of your skateboard just to.
Press a button, listen to anything.
Okay, so press a button, listen to anything. And using this $15,000 cash scenario, let's also give it a timeline. Ideally, when would you have something finished by?
Let's say, so it's August. Let's say October 1st.
Okay, so October 1st, so 3 months. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Cool. So now all of a sudden we can say, okay, well, our quarterly budget is exactly that 15. Our monthly budget, we're actually going to split into 3 months, which makes our weekly budget $11.90. Based on this information, we can kind of figure out, okay, well, are we going to work with part-timers or going to work with full-timers? Full-timers is probably going to be 0. Part-timers, let's first see, okay, well, on a weekly basis, if we're working with someone at $50 an hour, sorry, that shouldn't be hours. It shouldn't be dollars. We're getting about 23.81 hours per week. So depending on the complexity of the product or who you're working with, that could mean 1 or 2 people. So 1 or 2 people stretched over the course of 3 months. We now kind of have a framework. So let's say that it's 2 people. And as far as our hired people, we're going to say 0 because we're going to assume that we're internally designing it, either using a backend as a service or have built that backend internally. So in a spreadsheet, we've kind of laid out, here's the basic structure of how we're thinking about our project. We've got a $15,000 total cash budget. Over the quarter, we're going to spend $15,000. We want to spend that evenly over about 3 months. So we're going to spend $5,000 per month, which ends up being a weekly budget of $11.90. Now, transferring this into a project in different milestones, a week is not really enough to see real results, but 23 hours isn't nothing. So you should set yourself up for at least seeing some kind of screen share or video progress, but you want to use these monthly budgets as those kind of line in the sand for setting objectives. So let's, before we even jump over to the PM tool, let's kind of set some major milestones. Now I'm going to start this with, since we have 3 months, we're going to do a final milestone, month 2, and month 1. And I'm going to actually make this final milestone your skateboard. So press a button, listen to anything. And in some way, shape, or form, we should define that. But as we start thinking of things in 1 month and $5,000, it gets a little easier to kind of give some structure to, well, what is it that we can actually build? So with a $50 rate, we've got about 100 hours to use in a month. And based on the conversations that we had in our last session with developers, we have an idea for what that might take. So at this stage, I'm going to actually move it over to Turtle now that we have this like basic context of an application. So let's, I had a few other scenarios that we can go through here, but we're going to just create a new one. So iOS app for audio listening of text content. Does that sound about right? So we're going to zoom in just so we can work just in the context of this app. And for starters, I would actually just plan the first month. So yes, we have a $15,000 total budget. Yes, we should be communicating that to our team members, but we will be able to make better decisions as we inch closer to that second month and that third month. So I would actually fine tune this down to just, okay, well, what can we do in a first month? And based on our prior spreadsheet, we know that, well, the first month isn't nothing, it's 100 hours. So let's actually go ahead and set a 100-hour budget and a due date of, let's maybe say Friday, September 6th. So about a month from now. And do you see how before we even put any tasks in there, before we did anything, we already gave ourselves the context to wind this down into something that's more manageable. So we started with $15,000 budget. We still have that as our main context, but by simply saying, well, let's think about it in the context of a month, and then based on a month, we already know that we're going to think about it in the context of 1/3 of our total budget. Now it gets us into better position to start planning out, okay, what is it that we can actually get done? So you wouldn't do this alone. You would do this with your designers, your product managers, eventually your developers as well. But the next step from here would be lining out, okay, well, what is it that we're going to try to get done in the confines of that first 100 hours and that first budget? So very basic, it might be, basic app architecture. So getting a Hello World app might be the way that this is described. So I'm actually going to put this in there. So Hello World app. This is assuming that you're starting from scratch. If you've come at this with a basic app already and you've either done it yourself or you've done it with your internal team, you can ignore this. Next up, we're going to start thinking about the actual features that are important to us. So login, we're going to skip because this is the first month. We're just going to use it ourselves. We're going to get right to the meat of what is it that's our product. And high level, it's going to be press a button, listen to audio content. And a developer might push back on that and say, okay, well, what is my audio content coming from? So we'll first have to feed in sample text content. And in the context of an app, it's probably going to read in sample text content. So you would probably want to provide them with, here's a web page, here's a text web page that I want to be able to transcribe into an audio version. So there's one real case sample scenario. I would really recommend using a very real use case. Not only because it drops, sorry, one sec. It should be okay on battery for the next few minutes. I would use a very real case because not only does it remove friction necessary for somebody understanding, it can also get someone excited. So if you're working with a developer that's also into music or sports or anything else, and you use a scenario of, I'm going to take this Pitchfork article and make it into audio content, that gets someone very tangibly thinking about a real article. So for this read and sample content, I might link in, let's use this Pitchfork article. And now we've kind of removed just like more stuff that a developer has to think about that isn't really a developer's job to do. You're the product owner. You're the one that should be giving context into how this product is going to be used in the real world. So now you've given them a real world scenario. And then next task will be, so read out audio content from text. And very simply, we've now put together a basic semblance of our skateboard. We might want to put in other things in there. So, visual player, because at first it's probably going to be just a text link that says play my audio content. That'll probably be, and let's put that in the description. So like no design, plain text link to just start play. And then inside of the visual player, we might want to Figma link. Whether it's a wireframe or whether it's a full design, we'll actually put that inside of here. Give me one sec. I'm just going to actually plug in so I'm not worried about the computer dying on me.
I had to do that a few minutes ago. I ran in the other room and got a charger and came back.
Okay, we're good now. Okay, so now we have this visual player. And let's say that inside of that visual player, or actually let's put it just another subtask to keep this thing simple. But we want to do speed up, slow down, because that's pretty common for audio content. And we're starting to put in the features that we know are going to be important to our users, but we're not sure when exactly the dev plan they might fit. And we're now actually going to start prioritizing them visually with the most important stuff up top and the least important stuff at the bottom. So Very quickly, we've gotten the construct of we're working over the course of the next month. We've got about a 100-hour budget, and here's the basic setup of the app that we're going to be working on. What this will do is it'll put you in a position to then start getting estimates from developers on what this may actually take. So a basic app architecture typically takes a few hours to maybe a full day. It shouldn't take a full day really if somebody's using a Create React app or something like that, but let's pretend that they need some kind of special tuning and this is a 5 to 10 hour thing. Now we can see our budget compared to our estimates is now, we're starting to eat at that. Now press a button, listen to audio content is too kind of broad on its own for somebody to give an estimate to, but in the context of in the next month and in those subtasks, it makes it much easier. So read in sample content, a developer might come in and say, let's just read things in via plain text file to start, so that they don't have to think about what is the source, how are they scraping that text, et cetera. We're again breaking down and simplifying what is it that read in sample text content means and getting very refined about it. And even without using code or any developer language, just simplifying it down so that we're all talking about the same thing. And now with this context, a developer might go in and say, okay, well, that'll take me 4 to 6 hours. Now, read out audio content from text is probably the most complicated part of what we're doing.
Hey Vlad, quick question.
Sure.
That number that you're putting in, that's the dev putting that in themselves.
Correct.
On the turtle end.
Yes.
Okay.
But the same thing could be mimicked with whether you're working with a full-time team member or whether you're working with other freelancers. Like what we're doing right now, we're doing visually, but this can all happen conversationally. So I don't want you to think that if you're not using Turtle, you can't do this. Like this is more about a mindset than a specific product. Like, yes, I have put energy into visually building this with our team and kind of showing visually the culmination of how I think about budgeting. But there's nothing that complicated. Like really, I'm starting with a budget and I'm putting in subtasks that add up to that budget. There's nothing more complicated than that. This is just a visual representation of that happening live. So yes, this would come from a developer or at least a conversation with a developer where you're getting a range. Read out audio content from text. This is probably the most complicated nugget of what you're doing. Developers are likely to have questions of, are we using some kind of pre-built engine for this? And you probably will do. So either an audio transcriber, maybe some kind of natural language processing that might actually happen from text to audio, but you're probably not going to totally reinvent the wheel. You're probably not going to build a text to audio transcriber from complete scratch, unless you're having kind of humans involved in the loop and actually having humans do that process, which is a totally different product. I'm assuming that this is going to be, and this is an important question to ask. It's, there's one kind of product where text hits a human person goes and records that, and that's part of your product process. And then there's a version of this where it's text hits a machine, and that machine then transcribes it to audio. Let's assume that we had that conversation, and is it machine or is it human?
Oh, it's all machine. So we actually have all this stuff already built. I just didn't want to interrupt you.
Awesome. All machine transcription. So that's great. That the context of already have this built. So basically, I now know that instead of having to build this audio transcriber, I'm just plugging into an API.
Exactly.
So
it's just an endpoint.
That's awesome. So plugging into an API, that gives me the context that we didn't have 10 minutes ago and a developer wouldn't have had 10 minutes ago of, this thing that I thought was going to be the biggest chunk of what we're working on is now, okay, well, I just have to spend a couple hours probably understanding the endpoint, maybe giving the team feedback on what to improve on the endpoint. This might be like a 2 to 4 hour thing versus something that I originally thought might have been a 50 to 100 hour thing.
Or like 10,000.
I mean, you can go very deep on audio transcription.
Oh my God. Yeah.
2 to 4 hours. Now this visual player, it's really going to depend on the designs. If there's 3 screens, this might be like, really, and trust a developer to give you their best estimate based on the information they have and feed them with as much information as you possibly can. But let's assume that it's 8 screens, 8 mobile screens, and they're completely unique. There's not really many shared components. They're pretty heavy on the animation, so there's stuff to customize in there. So, let's say that this may take kind of 60 to 80 hours. And then this speed up, slow down thing, let's assume that there's no kind of pre-built way to do this, and we have to do it on our own somehow. And this is another thing that's going to be 40 to 80 hours. So very quickly, we kind of can see that, well, we're already overestimate. So now we have the context of, well, we can't possibly work on this in the course of the first month. We're going to set ourselves up for failure. So let's maybe take that last piece, so that speed up, slow down, that isn't critical to that first month and may not be critical to our entire product, and we're just going to move it into a backlog for later section. So now if we zoom back in and see those rollups, all of a sudden we're within budget. And I promise I did not guess that 100-hour total. That just happened by accident. But now we're in this context of like, at least we're not setting ourselves up for failure. Well, at least we can all look at this with the same approach. Now, as in the same thinking of you've cut yourself down to a month so that you can think in the context of a month, you need to keep using that mentality as things are actually progressing. So let's say read and sample content. I set up a contract for myself so I can actually track time and we can kind of see how these budgets move around. So I have a $50 an hour contract on this. So let's say that, this took me 8 hours, got halfway done. And this is just a time entry, but it's part of a communications flow and how a project is actually moving along. So 8 hours, got halfway done. I can now see that there's 92 hours remaining in budget, because estimates are kind of like in accounting, your accounts payable, and then actual tracked hours are actually cash, essentially cash moving around. Once that's tracked, you can't really get it back. You can't really claw it back. Even in the scenarios where you are fighting with a developer or a team to claw those back, those don't typically end well. That's like, asking somebody to work weekends without compensation or something like that. So in this scenario, we noticed that we got halfway done with 8 hours. So we estimated only 4 to 6 hours. So something probably is wrong in the fact that we spent 8 hours and we're only halfway done. So from here, we would say, okay, well, we've got 92 hours remaining. We're in the first task running over budget. So in the next weekly meeting that you have, or whatever cadence you're using to meet with people, you absolutely want to cover that to understand, well, what is the complexity here? How can we unblock? How can we simplify? How can we get back on track for staying within these estimates? And even though we planned on a monthly basis, which was already a cut down of our original start of a 3-month basis, we now have the power to adjust even on a weekly basis in those regular intervals and even kind of asynchronously as one thing happens. Psychologically, you don't want to play the blame game. You don't want to say, hey, this took 8 hours and you said 4 to 6 hours originally. There's typically a reason that something like this happens. One of those reasons could be complexity. One of those reasons could be the wrong team member that's being dishonest. Obviously, if it's a wrong team member that's being dishonest, you don't want to keep working with them. But even in this scenario, this is a relatively low-cost way to gauge that. It's a relatively low-cost way to gauge that, and a way in which you can still adjust without a company falling under, because all we spent out of our entire 300-hour budget has now been 8 hours. So we now have almost 100% of our budget remaining to then still make those best next decisions. Let's assume that it wasn't quite that bad, though. Let's assume that it was just something was complex and we worked through it and then we simplified it and then we finished it off in 1 more hour. So now that task is complete. We have 91 hours remaining, and it puts us in the position to continue here. By the end of the month, you should see yourself in a scenario where you can kind of look at things by text or by task, by person. We spent a lot of energy creating this budget screen experience for customers so that they can visually embrace this information and use it to learn. So if you were looking at this in the context of Turtle, I could very easily see that by task, this week there was 9 hours spent on read and sample content. I could look at that by person and kind of the details of those time entries, and even at the transaction level of what that actually cost me. Again, this is a visual representation of something that I don't think is that complicated, just very few people actually do and look at. But stepping back to the number one reason for failure is running out of money, being not technical, or building the wrong thing is a recipe for running out of money. But using this information to constantly evolve, adapt, make the best next decisions, put you well ahead of the competition that's just kind of spending wildly without actually keeping an eye on this stuff. So does this kind of lay out what a real world scenario look like, and does this help kind of start getting you thinking about what a week of working with a developer and a month of working with a developer, and then kind of as progress is made, what things look like in following months look like?
Yeah, for sure. So like I think the biggest issue that I'm having right now is that like Brendan, so
Let me
Well,
actually pause the recording so we can just kind of go into it and make sure that
oh
we
yeah, yeah,
Wait,
yeah.
wait, wait. Really quick, Vlad, before you pause the recording, can I just comment on add to what you said for Nick and for your online audience?
Sure.
Take 30 seconds. So I just want to also point out that one of the benefits of Turtle's task setup here is prioritizing tasks. And if you're developing a minimum product, it's likely you have features that you know you want eventually, but you're willing to do without at first. What has worked really well for me has been laying them out in this task list, asking your developer to estimate the time investment for each one, and then making priority decisions based on low-hanging fruit, what might be useful but is only going to take a few hours of time. Really quick example is that for my app, we host photos, and I didn't know whether we wanted people to do that from their mobile phone or desktop. We found out that doing it from mobile phone would have taken way less time to develop. And so we ended up prioritizing that first just because we laid out the hours estimated first before we told the programmer get started. Okay, that's all I wanted to add for your online audience.
No, that's all. Thank you for adding that. And I just so this doesn't turn into a turtle pitch, I want to re-highlight the way in which Brianna described prioritizing and making those decisions. There's nothing about Turtle that's the only way to do that. If you are having these conversations with your developers and asking them how much things cost and kind of laying things out in an appropriate way, you can achieve the same results. It's just we find it so important that we productized it. But you absolutely can do this with the right process without Turtle as well.
Gotcha.
That said, Turtle's a pretty good way to do it.
Turtle is really good. I know you don't want to just be promoting your own product, but it is quite good.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. Cool. So I'm going to stop the recording just that, Nick, we can go pretty deep into your situation there. So give me a sec.